So you're in for a treat. Armando Quintero is our keynote speaker today. Armando is completely a Renaissance man. He is a deep thinker, a philosopher. He is an artist, a musician, and a leader in the state of California. He's been instrumental in shaping and reshaping water policy in the state. He sees solutions to complex issues on a landscape and cross-sector scale. He's a systems thinker and a leader in creating culture change. 2 decades ago, when he was a leader in the National Park Service, he created culture change by shifting to a community-based approach. When he was on the board of the Marin Municipal Water Board, he challenged past thinking and sought to increase relevancy. When he was an executive director at an institution within an academic institution, at an institute within an academic institution, he brought the best academic learning into water-based science practice. And now he's the director of the California State Parks, where he is seeing the possibilities in 21st century solutions and inclusive access. If you have a chance to talk to Armando, you'll know that his guides are his daughters, and that when he's at home, he spends time keeping bees and harvesting food from his garden, also connecting with his large family. Armando embodies collaborative leadership. We are so pleased to welcome you here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away, Armando.
Good afternoon. My name is Armando Quintero, and I'm actually the new director of the California State Park System. And it's a real honor to be with all of you this afternoon. And thank you so much, Lisa, for your leadership along the lines of landscape scale efforts. You really are making a worldwide impact, and it means a lot to me, to my colleagues, and to many people who I'm sure don't even know that you're doing this work. So thanks so much. The title of my talk this afternoon is The Evolution of the California State Park System, Looking Toward the Future in the 21st Century. And I'm going to begin with sort of the story of my first day on the job, but it begins a little earlier. It was actually July 17th of this year of 2020 that I was notified that I'd been selected to be the director of state parks. And I had to keep my mouth shut. Nobody could know because it's the governor's privilege to make that sort of an announcement. So I started studying state parks and diving deep into everything that I could learn about this agency, the lands, the programs, all of that. And exactly a month later, on August 17th, at 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife and I woke up because it sounded like there was a train hitting the front of our house. We live on a ridge in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco. And I went running into the living room and the screens had blown out of our front windows. The curtains were blowing into the house and there was leaves everywhere. And it was incredibly confusing because it just came out of nowhere. And what followed was one of the most epic lightning storms that I've ever seen in my life. Living on the ridge where we live, we could see Mount Tamalpais in Marin County. There were lightning strikes just repeatedly, and it just looked like something from the Wizard of Oz. Well, it turns out that night, a massive wind and lightning storm hit all of California. And what hit our house at 3 in the morning actually resulted in California with over 12,000 lightning strikes and 585 wildfires were set in that night across California. Set the stage for a very overwhelming climate change impact unlike any of us had ever imagined. In that fire, or rather that night, over 22 state parks caught fire. Many of them were severely damaged. Several were burned almost completely. And one park, which is Big Basin State Park down in Santa Cruz, was the first state park created or established in California. It was established in 1901. Virtually all of the structures in that park were burned to the ground. Many of them were historic structures. There was a brand new visitor center. The entire state park's collection of natural history objects, as well as cultural history objects, were lost in that fire. It was devastating. And here I'm looking at this whole scene of California on fire and looking at these state parks and thinking, oh my goodness, this is what I'm stepping into. On the last day of August, the Secretary of Resources called me, and rather than having me come to Sacramento to be sworn into the job, I was told to go to Santa Cruz. And I was told to go to the Emergency Operations Center near Big Basin, and that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I would be sworn in by Zoom. I did that, and it was the Secretary of Resources and the Undersecretary who are on Zoom, both swearing me in, and each of them had their daughters in their arms. The Secretary had his daughter, Calla, who's 6 years old, in his arms. The Undersecretary had her daughter, Michaela, who was 9 months old, in her arms. When I finished getting sworn in, I asked if we were going to be sure to put Calla and Michaela on the witness list to my swearing in, because my sensibility at that moment was that those children are the people who we are working for when it comes to managing the public lands in California. After being sworn in, at noon, I was up at the headquarters of Big Basin. The forest was still smoldering. The mother of the forest, which is this coast redwood, which is one of the largest trees, or is the largest tree in the park, literally had a pocket of flame near the canopy of the tree, still burning out of a bowl or a place where a limb had fallen off the tree. It was an astonishing first day. And right around noon, Governor Gavin Newsom appeared with members of the media, members of his staff. There were people from FEMA. There were a number of folks who showed up that day to tour Big Basin. And the rangers who I had just met did the tour for all of us. And when we finished the tour, as we were walking back for a press conference that the governor was going to hold, he stopped. I happened to be walking next to him. He stopped and turned to the group and he said, "Hey, I'd like to introduce you to the new director of California State Parks." He goes, "This is Armando Quintero." And then without warning, he said, "Armando, why don't you give us your vision for the California State Park system?" It was one of those moments where I knew I had to just express what I had been ingesting over the previous weeks and month, and talk about a moment of clarity in a way. So I said something along these lines. The National Park System actually began with the establishment of a state parks reserve in a place called Yosemite. President Lincoln actually created a state reserve in Yosemite, assigned it to the state, and that land grant persisted as basically a state property until 1906, when it became a national park. So that was the first state lands relative to public lands in California. And then in 1901, the Sempervirens League, a nonprofit that works to preserve redwoods, lobbied the legislature and the communities to create a new idea, which they wanted to create a California state park, which would be the beginning of a California state park system. And what they chose was Big Basin. So Big Basin, having been established in 1901, then became the focus of conservation groups that raised money for these places. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that, having worked as a national park ranger and having worked in public lands in various capacities over the years, we all think about the traditions that we are carrying forward, those things that we've inherited. And I stood there in this moment, in this smoldering forest, with the structures burned to the ground, and the resources incredibly damaged by this catastrophic fire. And I literally thought, oh my goodness, what are the traditions that we need to create for the next century? Because here, if we'd been paying attention, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. And I mentioned in that moment that it was really important to acknowledge that these park systems were actually created in partnership with the public, created in partnership with nonprofits. So from the very beginning, these land management agencies have in their double helix or DNA private and public partnerships. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember as we go forward, particularly when we're talking about landscape scale networks and all of the innovation that it takes to nurture and create those opportunities and nurture them in a way that they can be highly successful. So what I also said is that, you know, we are at an extraordinarily complex set of crossroads. So how are we going to deal with this complexity? And what I said was, in terms of a vision for the state parks, is that we need to make sure that all of our actions and all of our decisions are addressing climate change. We need to, in this time, think about the practices of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have to think very seriously in a very focused manner in terms of the enhanced protection that we have to give the cultural and natural resources. And in that moment, I was actually thinking, here we talk about natural resources going back all the way to the prehistoric dinosaurs and the fossil record and all of that. But in many places, when we talk about human history, it begins just a few hundred years ago. And so in that moment, I was also thinking, we really need to go back to the first people and make sure that they're included in the stories that we tell in these places. And of course, what we also need to do, given the impacts of the world as we are all experiencing them, is make sure that our practices have to do with sustainability, that we apply the best science and the best knowledge when it comes to planning. An essential part of all of this is also strengthening partnerships. And so what I did is I ended my comments with the following two observations. One of them was that because of COVID, we have all experienced that for the public, these public lands are essential landscapes. These public lands are places where people have found themselves in the last year going to for physical health, for mental health, and also I think for social well-being. These places are more important than ever. And so having begun this conversation, talking about the traditions of this first national and state park system in California that now extends all over the place, there's something else that we have to do, and that is we have to define in a very intentional way, what are the traditions that we want to move forward into the next century when it comes to our public lands? It's an amazing opportunity that we all find ourselves in. So in this year, where we have this confluence of disasters and consequences combined with shelter in place and all of the things that we all are experiencing, we're masked, we are isolated. And I have found that in the role that I'm in a very intense way, I feel like I'm in this crucible. I feel like I'm in almost a chrysalis, reflecting about what it is that these places are and what's going on with them and what are we going to do relative to our collective histories, the experiences of the past, experiences of the present, and how do we imagine our way going forward. So, as I said, these landscapes, I think, have an extraordinary value in terms of physical, mental, and social well-being. And when it comes to these landscapes, what we really need are healthy, functioning, complex landscapes in order for these systems to provide not only the ecosystem services, but I now think of them as the social system services. These parks are a place where the evolution of humans is apparent in the landscape. So we've got these lessons that we can learn. We can see the mistakes that we've made. We can also discover mistakes made in the past as well as successes. And one of the things that's astonishing about the environments in which we all work is that these environments offer multiple platforms to inform and demonstrate to the public the values of the land and waterscapes of our communities, of our states, of the nation, and frankly, the world. These places really are our provision of clean air, water quality as well as water quantity, the power of carbon sequestration as we make sure that these systems remain healthy. It can affect our climate. And all of this supports complex biodiverse systems. And I think it's important that we have the ability to message to everybody that, or to everyone who comes to these places, especially with this influx of new visitors as a result of COVID, that we too are one of the species that are a part of these biodiverse systems. I sincerely believe that the practice of creating landscape scale networks is one of the singular most important efforts as land managers that we can undertake in this 21st century. What I want to talk now about is California state parks. And what I'm going to do is give you some examples and some context into what state parks as a lens offers into the world in which we are all operating. And in this conference, we're all talking about different facets having to do with land management. And some of the things that are happening are very specific. But what I want to do is give some examples of what I'm learning, what I'm seeing. And I also want to preface this with acknowledging absolutely clearly that I do consider myself continually as a student. I think that all the voices in the room are really critical for us to be able to advance as effectively as possible. And what I like to say is that right now, we need all the wisdom in the room and from wherever we can get it. And so diversity to me means diversity of thinking, diversity of experience, diversity of people, diversity of solutions, and also diversity of defining the problems, because sometimes that's actually the barrier, is we haven't defined the problem. So the California State Park System is really an astonishing collection of landscapes, both historical, cultural, landscapes and natural landscapes. And there's a ton of recreation opportunities, and it absolutely is a full array of biologically diverse ecosystems. And just a quick list, there's 280 state parks in California. There's 9 off-highway vehicle areas. There's over 300 miles of the California coastline, which is actually a part of the state park system. There's nearly 500 miles of off-highway vehicle trails, almost 700 miles of lake and coast shoreline. And these parks have well over 70 million visitors a year. And every single one of these parks is part of a much larger and critical landscape, whether it's a natural landscape or a cultural landscape, whether it's urban or rural. It's a really interesting time to have stepped into this role, because as of 2013, the California State Park System has been going through a very intentional transformation. And we brought in, the state leadership brought in a number of thought leaders, looked at senior park staff and all park staff, brought in park stakeholders, and a major nonprofit partner in California, the Resources Legacy Fund, actually supported the development of something called the Parks Forward Commission. And this resulted in the creation of something called a transformation team, which really rethought parks and looked at how the organization was set up, the things that we were doing as an agency or as a department. And the work done in the last several years has just been an amazing effort of resetting the stage for how we move forward. So the timing is really pretty astonishing. And I'm very excited about the momentum that this effort is already generating and the direction in which we're going. One of the things that I feel very lucky about, and I think it's very enlightening to share with you, that the Governor of California and the Secretary of Natural Resources for California have demonstrated their commitment to the issues that we're all working with by the establishment of new deputy secretaries at the secretary level in the state government. And I'll just mention a few of these, which have a very direct connection to the work that we are doing. There's now a Deputy Secretary of Resources for California for biodiversity and habitats. We also have a new Deputy Secretary for External Relations for California, and a part of that person's focus is environmental justice, diversity, and access issues. We also have an undersecretary, or a deputy secretary rather, whose focus is forest resource management. We have a deputy secretary who is focused on climate change. And we also have a deputy secretary who's focused on oceans and coastal policy. So you can see that there's actually a whole leadership team that the California State Park System and our partners and our landscape scale partners can all connect to and see literally priorities stemming from the governor's office right to the ground where the public is going to recreate and to recreate themselves. So what I want to do is talk about Big Basin, just as an example of how we're moving forward, because Big Basin literally has to be rebuilt from the ground up. It has to be reimagined from the ground up. That park is nearly 20,000 acres of redwood forest. There's a lot of old growth redwood forest in there. At the headquarters, where I mentioned at the beginning of my conversation here with you, the canopy of that redwood forest is about 300 feet. When we were on that walk through the forest, there were folks there from the Cal Fire Department, and there were firefighters there who had gone there to respond to the fire. And I asked them how high the flame heights were. And a coastal redwood forest, for those of you who have not experienced one, is actually a forest that is fog dependent. These are really wet places. There's lots of water on the ground. Generally, the ground is moist year round, but in August, conditions were so dry and had been so dry for the previous year, which, by the way, last year, Los Angeles saw temperatures of 120 degrees, which is really just unheard of, and what a signal about climate change. Well, what happened is at the heart of Big Basin, the flame heights of that forest fire were 500 feet. And for those of you who are familiar with coastal redwood forests, that's absolutely unimaginable, but that's how serious that was. So here's what we're doing. With the leadership team, the regional leadership team down at Big Basin in Santa Cruz, and also with folks from Sacramento, what I've asked in what we decided to do as a team is to make sure that we set the table for partnerships and stakeholders so that we could all be setting our expectations on how we were going to be moving forward and rethinking how we manage this park for the future. And what we talked about was creating a template that perhaps we could use as a template to put over other projects and other parks, because we are making actually very new and very intentional considerations around what we have to do as land managers to assure the sustainability of these places and of our management practices. So I want to run through just some of the things that hit the high point of the initial meeting. This was mostly internal, but we're about to move into a phase of working with stakeholders and partners and really starting to engage basically the world and helping us rebuild Big Basin State Park for the future. So we're looking at regional partnerships for acquisition and management. What does it mean when we talk about sustainable design? How do we apply climate change planning as we are able to actually look at this entire park with its ecosystems and its human systems and look forward? And one of the things that includes, for example, is how do we plan this park so it can be a part of the effort to reach 100% renewable energy and zero carbon electricity by 2045, which is one of California's goals. How do we think about landscape scale changes given climate change and working with our natural resources teams and coming up with plans that actually look ahead toward likely landscape changes? In the past, we had built, the human built environment had been placed right on top of the most precious areas within this forest. It's probably not a good idea to do that again. So we're looking at large scale resources management planning within this 20,000 acre park. And one of the things that's happened is that effort is we're starting to realize that it's probably going to make sense that we acquire new properties outside of the footprint of these precious areas, and that perhaps rather than building all the infrastructure of water treatment, wastewater treatment, and all of that within these precious ecosystems, that we put them at the edge and connect them to municipalities and services there. One of the things that happens in a catastrophic fire is that it reveals archaeologic sites and really provides for new discoveries in the park. So there was an extensive effort of doing high-tech mapping of Big Basin and understanding where all the cultural resources were, and that also will affect the planning for how we move forward in managing this landscape. We're obviously looking at traffic planning now, and how do we move people through this landscape? What does the new trail system look like? How do we take advantage of things that we may not have recognized as valuable overlooks or valuable experiences in these ecosystems? Because as you know, many of the parks that we all work in and many of the public lands that we work in, we've inherited basically road cuts. And a lot of times those road cuts were actually right on top of Native American pathways and things. So given the way we're looking at the world now, what do we know given the technology that we use, things like vehicles, things like public transport? How do we manage all of that going forward? We also are looking at how do we preserve historic infrastructure. So what's interesting is that when I think of European countries, you go there and they've got ruins, they've got ancient sites and things like that. And years ago, I used to manage Alcatraz and portions of the North Shore of San Francisco for the National Park Service. And I was always struck by the notion that Alcatraz was actually one of the few contemporary ruin sites that we were managing as a cultural resource for the nation and for the world. So there's a lot of rethinking that goes on that actually has us in a way, and I hadn't really thought about it this way before, but it has us thinking about the places we manage now, but from 100 years ahead and looking back. And what matters? How do we do this? What do we preserve? And mixed with all that, and I'll stop with this relative to Big Basin, is with this incredible increase of visitor interest and visitation to these parks, how are we going to establish carrying capacities? How do we make this work as a wonderful experience for the public, as well as the planning that we do to assure that we're protecting the resources in these incredible areas? So our next step with Big Basin is going to be to start working with stakeholders. There's already been a fair amount of fundraising that's been going on. It's an incredibly exciting effort. And I just bow to the team that's working on this and to the community leadership, to the leaders of Save the Redwoods League, of the Fund, of all of the other community groups that are just emotionally tied to these places. I mean, really the loss of these places through this climate change impact, I equate it to the loss of a family member for many people, certainly for employees. They've dedicated their lives in some cases to these places that have been severely damaged. And there are families that at this point for generations have been visiting these places. So what we're protecting is far more than just a footprint. And it's an incredible challenge. There's also a team at state parks that has been hyper-focused on sea level rise planning. And of course, with state parks having over 300 miles of coastline in California, it's something that is a very real consideration in terms of how we move forward. We're just about to release the sea level rise plan. Our public facing document should be out I think in about a month or so. I've read through it. I've worked with the team, and I have to say that the work that they've done has really been integrated with other agencies, communities. It's been very thoughtful effort. And I see it as a plan that allows for relatively rapid and agile response to sea level rise. And the big focus through that plan is absolutely in partnerships. Partnerships with communities, partnerships with homeowners, partnership with folks who are involved with coastal resources. I mean, it's really critical. As I mentioned earlier, there is now a Deputy Secretary for Forest Management in California. And this year, we just submitted our budget. And one of the things that has made it so far in the budget process, specifically for state parks, which is also a signal as to the commitment to dealing with one of the very critical issues that we have to manage, not only in California, but throughout the West and throughout the nation. And that is, how are we going to manage these forests that in many cases have become tinderboxes in the last 200 years? And how do we make critical and effective advancements in protecting these places from catastrophic wildfire? So this year in the budget, we have $85 million actually as a one-time allocation, which we hope to hang on to, that will increase both the pace and the scale of forest management at state parks. And this is actually something that ties right into climate change adaptation in California. And really, when you look at forest management reducing the threat of critical fire, the investments are pennies on the dollar. And with the damage that we saw this year in terms of landscapes in the communities of California, I don't think that's a notion that's lost on anyone. And in fact, typically in a fire year in California, the fire year in California is usually from somewhere in July until maybe mid-November. That's a long, typical fire year in the past. And since 2000, during that fire season, we've seen about 700,000 acres burn in California. Just to give you some perspective, this year, we're in January, we're still in fire season. Just in the last week, there have been dozens of fires that have been started in Southern California because it's so dry. And this year, rather than 700,000 acres being lost to catastrophic wildfires, over 4 million acres burned in California. And not only did it overwhelm our own firefighting capacity, but we ended up having to rely on firefighters from other places in the United States to come in and give us a hand. We had firefighters coming in from Australia, firefighters coming in from Mexico. It turned into an international effort. And so the investment that we can make can't be stressed in terms of the return on the dollar. And it's interesting because I'm realizing that, our job is not only to think, but it's also to rethink all the time and to really question ourselves. So I want to talk about a couple more things, then I'll wrap up here, because I know I want to be able to answer your questions and hear what kinds of things you're interested in rather than that, I think they'll be interested in this. There are 3 major partnerships that state parks has in California, but there are dozens and dozens of really critical partnerships. So these are by no means the only partnerships. In Southern California, there's a national park called the Santa Monica Mountains, or Santa Monica National Recreation Area. And there, that landscape is actually operated as a cooperative effort, and it joins federal, state, and local park agencies, along with private reserves and landowners. And The communal effort is about protecting the natural and cultural resources of this giant transverse mountain range. It goes from coast and heads inland. So you've got seashore to mountaintops just north of LA. It's a phenomenal place and really an amazing group of partners working together there to manage that place or that landscape. Here in Marin County, where I live, I had the privilege of working with some other team members and team leaders to help create a landscape scale network called One TAM. And that effort, 2 years of effort, and I really want to give a shout out to a leader in that effort. Her name is Sharon Farrell, and I hope she's participating in this conference. Would not have happened without Sharon. She's one of the most amazing teachers that I've ever been able to work with. And after an effort of a few years, it resulted in a memorandum of understanding between the California State Parks, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, Marin County Parks, and a water utility, the Marin Municipal Water District. And those 4 agencies are in partnership with the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy, which acts as our nonprofit umbrella. And I'll tell you, the experience of working with this group and seeing what a landscape scale partnership can mean for regional, meaningful landscape scale planning is absolutely mind-blowing. And one of the things that I also saw is that think of a mountain that's divided up into these sections managed by 4 different land managers, and think about how we all work to get grant support and money. And we're competing against each other, even though it's the same mountain. So one of the things that resulted from that effort is a partnership that now allows us to apply for grants as partners. And the amount of support that has come in as a result of this partnership, I think makes a lot of sense, because I think the public likes it when they see effective management occurring with public lands. And it's interesting because we all in our various organizations know, the area that we're operating, the area that we're managing, but to the public, those lines are invisible. So these landscape scale networks offer co-messaging that is extraordinarily powerful, and actually I think helps create a more logical linkage in the public's mind as to how these lands are managed and how we need to be paying attention to them cooperatively. On the north coast of California, there is a collection of both national parks and state parks. And a few years ago, through the incredible efforts of Save the Redwoods League, which is just an amazing a nonprofit that works with both coastal redwoods and the giant sequoias of the Sierra Nevada. They led the effort to create this collaborative partnership, which is called Redwoods Rising. And it now encompasses 120,000 acres in partnership. And it is a collaboration of 3 state parks, a national park, and Save the Redwood League. And it really is these are some of the models that I think of for state parks to be looking at, because it's pretty clear that for all of us working in public lands, whether it's a state park or any other public land, we are always just a piece of a landscape mosaic. And these lands, being a piece of a mosaic, continually offers opportunities for partnerships with landowners, municipalities, agencies, tribes, NGOs, and members of the public. And there are numerous examples of landscapes being protected in partnerships of various types with the California State Parks. And there's some really impressive ones out there, and there continues to be new ideas coming forward continually. And really, none of this work could be done if it were not for partnerships. And when I reflect about where we are right now, we are in a critical moment, and I know you all know this, but we're in a critical moment, unlike anything that any of us have imagined. And so I feel like where we are, our ancestors are sitting on our shoulders, our kids are watching us right now. I often find that the questions that I get from kids, if you really are listening, are perhaps some of the wisest problem statements that you could imagine. And of course, the future's waiting to see what we're going to do. And with that, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to each one of you for what you're doing. Barry Lopez, one time in some work I was doing, sent a note, and what he said, I'll now extend to you, which is, he said, the work you are doing is work we cannot do without. Thank you so much for your time, for your work, and for your attention. And I really do think that my comments may be of more value if I'm able to answer your questions and what's on your mind. So I'm going to stop, and I'd like to take your questions, and I think we're going to do that via the chat function. And I really look forward to talking with you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Armando.
Good morning, Lisa.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon and morning. Yeah,
yes, exactly. It's good. It's both. It's and, right? Both and.
Yeah.
I remember when I was flying to Sri Lanka with Isabel when she was in kindergarten to visit my brother in the Peace Corps, and she was with her cousin who was in first grade also, and my brother. And the question that they kept asking is, what time is it? Is it? And I was like, time actually is really relative, and you're actually getting to really experience that right now firsthand.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, right? So thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Yeah, great to hear that story, and there's so many things that will come out of this, but what I want to do first is turn to, I think we've got a question from the audience, and Rob is going to be the voice of the audience over here, and so he's got a question for us.
Oh, Armando, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the first question we have is from Virginia, and she's asking what can be done to guard parks from suffering the constant cycle of protection, repeal, exploit, etc. So how do we protect parks from just the movements that happen in that way?
Wow. It's funny, just before I got online this morning, I sent a note to one of the historians in state parks, and I said, hey, I haven't been able to find a good administrative history of state parks in California, and I'm really concerned that we're sort of inventing, we're inventing the history of the parks, but literally in just recent memory, as if that's how it's always been. So I think contextually, what I would say is begin with understanding the history of the place, and actually, that's a great question, and it's absolutely what was on my mind before I joined you guys. And so I think really understanding context, understanding the organization, the people and the motivations behind those various pressures on public lands. And then it really is going to be, I think, a unique set of solutions to go in and figure out how to protect these areas. And I think that's one of those situations where you may find yourself with, strange bedfellows, which can often be, a source of strength rather than conflict. So I'll leave it at that. That's a great question.
Yeah, it really is. And that question of repeating cycles, right? And just understanding where are we in the context of this great churn of humanity that we're in. And as you're talking about reimagining parks, and right now we're reimagining conferences and connections and so many things, reimagining swearing-ins. But it really is an important question.
Yeah.
I think we have another question from the audience.
So related to that, from the historical perspective, how will you include traditional ecological knowledge and cultural history and traditions to inform future landscaping planning?
Two things. Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. A few years ago, state parks hired a gentleman to put together basically an atlas of the first people in California. I just met with him recently to look both at his work and to talk with him about where it's headed. And basically what he has done is created a really interesting template that shows this very layered map of the various language groups and peoples of California over time. And as you go to these maps, you can dive in and not only look at a language group or a population of a particular group of people, you also can hit a tab and see the trade routes with the other groups in that region. And one of the things is understanding the regional histories and the statewide histories in the areas we work, I think is really important. And I was thinking that this atlas is actually going to provide an additional framework for descendants of Native people and Native people, because they are the descendants of those Native populations. In a way, it acknowledges, I was looking through this and I was thinking, wow, this is going to say, hey, look, I'm real. My people are real. We don't, and by real, I mean real to the world. And so I think there's a couple things that are important relative to that question. And one of them is sort of honoring the cultural context and presence of these populations is a critical part of that. And then engaging those folks. And in California, we are doing that. We're bringing folks in not only as sort of subject area experts around things like control burns and how that was traditionally applied, but we're also doing things like, well, I'll mention something that I was very touched by, which I just found out about a few days ago. And I've been really thinking a lot and talking about the need to acknowledge these public lands that people go to, that we all go to. I think it's important that we start acknowledging who the ancestral people were there. And many of the descendants of those people are still around in these regions. And one of the parks in California, I found out that they've been doing the work with the local tribes. And along with the park entrance, there's now going to be, probably around June, signs that say, you're now entering the ancestral lands of, and then it's the group's name. And it's the broader group names, because there's always these subgroups with different names, but the folks at this park worked with the community to figure out what name could represent the groups that everybody would agree to. And there are just some really interesting things that are coming forward relative to what are the design elements for a sign like that, and I think that, so I mentioned three things: really understanding the history of the Native people, going back in time and honoring sort of their presence and their impact on the landscapes. As we all, I think, understand, the landscapes that was encountered by the Europeans and other folks that came in from other continents was very much a human impacted landscape by the first people who were here. And so, it's going to be really important to acknowledge that. And I do think that we need to be bringing in people from the Native communities, the ancestral communities, to work with land managers as partners. So the development of MOUs and creating relationships with folks. And then also, and then doing a public acknowledgement, because I think all of those actions will create different signals to the different players within that network that'll actually make it work. That's my answer.
That's great, Armando, thank you. It's been interesting. We've had so many robust, deep conversations over the last couple of days, but one of them has been about naming ancestral lands and ancestral features and things like that. And one of the things that we were doing yesterday is also sharing for people the idea of, what's the ancestral land upon which you are sitting right now. And so here we are with the people of the Three Fires who are here, and vibrant community. And then also we did the text your zip code or your city state and find out which ancestral land, which is ripe with some, all kinds of errors, like you said, just deciding what is the actual name that you're going to use. Right. But one of the things that we were reflecting on is, reflect on, why do we need to have a bot to get this name? And so just like, as you text your city state to this number, you then receive a text back with what your ancestral land is. And so kind of, why do we need that? And I think when we've done the watershed awareness pieces where we put up you're now entering for me right now, we're in the Huron watershed. And so those kind of signs increase that awareness to people like, oh, you're in a watershed. What is a watershed? And so that's the awareness. And it's like, oh, you're on the ancestral and current lands of these people who have been here for a long, long time. And so just that awareness of those signs is actually also really, I think that goes a long ways to people's knowledge and awareness.
I agree. And I think that it's really valuable rather than explaining the whole thing to actually just offer signals that'll go like, hey, wait a minute, just like you just said, oh, we're in a watershed. Oh, this is the Kashiapomo people's ancestral land, or I'm actually talking to you from the Coast Miwok, the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people. Just a quick aside, when I worked at Point Reyes Seashore, which is to the west of me, about 30 minutes, I worked with Kashiapomo elders, and in 1986, when I was working there, my father died suddenly, and he was only 60 years old. And 2 days after, or the day after my dad passed away, one of the elders from the Kashiapomo community called me, and he said, hey, tomorrow night, you need to come to the roundhouse at Point Reyes. The community is going to do a mourning ceremony for your father.
Yeah.
And and I think that bringing in Native cultures and communities, living communities into these public lands can offer surprising and deep connections for all of us. And I obviously I just got emotional, but because I always do when I think about that. But I think that we open up so many doors just by putting up these signals and creating the opportunity for relationships.
It is, and yesterday we were talking, Yakuta and Kevin were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and culture, and you also know that when my younger brother Mark died, that I had that journey of like, I don't know, when I woke up the next morning, I'm like, I don't know where his soul is, but it's not in my bedroom, and so I'm going to go walk with him on his journey and take him there and just accompany him, and so those cultural practices that have that deep-rooted knowledge, or to maybe a moment, given that we're talking about tribal people and other things, is to talk about Blackfoot physics. And for folks who don't know that book, I'll just mention that, Blackfoot physics, and you can look into that. So
what you're adding to the list is that these places are also spiritual, essential places, essential spiritual places. Huh. I'm going to add that to when I talk about this now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So let's see. I think we could turn to another. I've got a couple of questions for you too at some point. And we'll have those over the course of our friendship. But otherwise, Rob's got another one from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah. So pivoting just a bit into the management strategies, but thinking about that historical piece and just the context that we bring into it. Your approach to, or what is your approach to managing the lands after these forest fires events? And knowing that climate change will change the landscape of what is able to thrive in those landscapes, how are you balancing between returning to what was historically there versus preparing for perhaps a new normal in some of these situations?
Well, we're applying the best science that we can garner in looking at how we learn as these landscapes recover, both on their own and work that we have to do to prevent things like catastrophic debris flows and floods. Because after a fire, as you know, the soil loses its capacity to be a really effective sponge, and then you get big rainstorms like we're getting in California at this very moment, and the water just takes the top of the soil off. So there's a combination of both making assessments of what's happening, bringing in the best science, and doing basically triage to sort of settle things down. But we've got a lot of people looking at how we do that. And one of the things that's interesting is, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the talk that I just gave, but at Big Basin, within a few weeks, these giant coast redwoods, which were literally completely black, started showing sprouts of new growth. And, I looked at that and I was talking with the team and I said, wow, these guys are a good model for us. What does our new growth look like? So that's a question that's yet to be answered, but we're looking at it so that we can do the best job going forward. And certainly a part of that is going to be continuing managed fire, managed fuel reduction in these landscapes in order to prevent catastrophic wildfires. That's a tough question. And also understanding Native communities and the impact of invasive plants, all of that ends up combining. And one of the things that's interesting that's a piece of this is so many of these public lands are adjacent to urban and suburban areas, right? And so you have that urban wildland interface. So that that boundary ends up being a really important place to think about in terms of how we're going to manage them, because in many of those areas, the most likely cause of a wildfire in the wildland begins with a fire in somebody's home. So you also have to need to think about that, the sources of ignition, and there's a lot to it in terms of making sure that when you can actually plan ahead for how you're going to tackle a fire in a geography. And that's something really important that's come out in California more publicly now, is that if I think for all of us and for all of you, it's really important to take a look at the historic fire maps of your geography, because what you'll find is there are periodic big fires right on top of the same footprints. The fires that you've heard about in the news in California, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, like up in Napa County and Santa Rosa to the north of us, those fires that burned hundreds of homes, actually, that fire burned the exact same footprint as it did just 80 years ago. So we can learn by literally, as I said earlier, taking a look at your history. Looking at the fire histories can also help inform that.
And Armando, that 80 years ago, presumably there were no fires there? No homes there?
No, there were some homes there, but we're humans. We'll rebuild, right? But unfortunately, we're not all coast redwoods, which love disaster. Redwoods they love floods and landslides and things, and their growth burgeons when those things sort of happen. But fire's a bigger challenge, so we'll see how that affects redwoods.
Great, thanks. And we've got another one from the audience.
So just more of a comment to say that I'm seeing a lot of support for just the genuine way that, you, Armando, being vulnerable and sharing that emotional response that you had, and also to Lisa. So I just want to acknowledge both of you, the appreciation coming from the chat, and certainly from myself as well. And I think from there we can have Lisa ask some of her questions. So.
Okay, let me know. Keep asking questions if you have them of Armando. Armando, so I want to turn to a slightly different take. So one of the things that we did, Mamie Parker was with us on Wednesday morning. Amazing story, an amazing woman, an amazing inspiration. So one of the things that over the course of the time, and in our Collaborating Well track, we've also been talking about all of the elements of how do you be vulnerable, how do you collaborate, how do you share, how do you listen, how do you not be purely transactional, how do you not be directional, and all of those elements. So and also how do you go ahead and go out on a limb and be scared. So I want to go back to the beginning of your talk when, so oftentimes in this story, there's so many stories of the young people. Like we have those times when we feel like, gosh, I have no right to be here. I was telling the story of several years ago at the conference, we had a student track where we had a high school student presenting with a PhD student, and I was sitting next to the high school student and he was really nervous, and I'm saying, you're good, you got this. Your stuff is great, and you have every right to be here, and all those kinds of things. But also talk to us about what it's like to be at your stage in the career with all of the experience that you have. And he turns to you and says, why don't you show us your vision for the state parks here in your first hour? Like that feel, so that the idea that maybe that feeling doesn't always ever go away. You don't ever reach a spot where you're just good.
No, and I know that what I said in that answer, and I've said it many times since, is we're at a moment in time where we need all the wisdom in the room, right. And in order to be able to, I think, be receptive to that, we have to be vulnerable, and oftentimes when I meet with the staff of state parks and with our park partners, I'll at some point early in the conversations, I'll always say, hey, look, I'm a student here with you. We really need to all, and also a couple months ago it was International Teachers Day, and this note came by my inbox. Now I almost just said, oh, okay, yeah, it's International Teachers Day, and then I ended up writing a letter to all staff in parks, and I said, you know what? Right now, you're all working from home. Many of you are taking care of kids in your family, and I just explained the situation that we're in right now. And I said, so thank you for working to raise the next generations in the middle of this chaos, and you're doing a work for state parks. So you are incredible teachers. And then as I finished that, I thought, wait a minute. And then the second paragraph was for everybody. And I said, if we really pay attention in the course of any day, we can be student and teacher at different times of the day. So International Teachers Day, that's like your day, right? But we should probably also have an International Students Day, come to think of it, So anyway, I think being vulnerable is absolutely what we need to do. And my wife gives me a hard time. She said, because over the years when I've done presentations, she'll say, why do you make people cry? And it's like, I'll say, because I think we have to get cracked open in order to be receptive. And and I don't do it intentionally, but that's why we love stories, right? I wish I'd listened to the stories last night that you all got to share, but I think that that's the power of humanness, is connecting, being vulnerable, learning, all that.
And then Armando, go ahead and share the reaction that you got to that email, right? So you sent that email, and then what was the response?
I was surprised. I got some very emotional responses from folks who were basically expressed surprise and a combination of acknowledgement and also self-reflection. And that was just my writing that note was an emotional reaction, really, to starting to think about that moment.
Yeah, so I want to close out on this, and then also, Rob, let me know, give me a shout if there's any other questions. So feel free to ask any questions. But I just want to close out on that idea of treating people as human beings. So you're the director of the state parks system in California. Pretty big job, a lot of people, right? Lots of money. And people think about that as power and all of those things. And I think one of the things that we at the Stewardship Network always embody is this idea of collaboration and bringing everybody to the table with a seat, whether you're a student, and we don't talk about experts, but we talk about people with varying levels of experience, and sometimes it's decades and decades, and in many different facets, and sometimes you're Eric Robinson, who won the Story Slam last night, who's just come out and just discovered nature and macroinvertebrates, and is just so excited. And we're so excited to have you at the table, Eric, and welcome you along with people like Armando side by side. But maybe, Armando, in the closing minutes, if you want to just say a little bit about your experience with that over the years. I know that you have, in your introduction, one of the things that I said is that you've kind of challenged past thinking and just what that's like. One of the things that Mamie talked about also is the idea that sometimes you have to say things for a little while before people listen, and sometimes people don't, but it doesn't mean that not everybody will, and some of that kind of thing. So maybe if in the final minutes, if you can just do a little reflecting on that.
Recently, I was giving some welcome comments to a class of park rangers that were in a week-long class at one of our training centers. And I spoke for only a few moments, believe it or not, just a few moments. And then I was taking questions. And like the third question I got from a ranger was, so what's the toughest thing about being director of state parks? And that question caught me off guard. And then here I am looking at a screen of 40 rangers, and we are talking about park issues and park stuff. And and I said, actually, it's remembering that I'm the director of state parks. And I said, look at us. We're having this conversation. It's engaged. We all are thinking about it. I'm listening to you. You're teaching me stuff, and I have, I don't know why, but since I was a kid, I've never, my daughters were in their mid-20s, tease me, have always teased me and said, oh, Dad, you're 7 years old. And it was just my birthday recently, and which put me into the 1A group for COVID.
Congratulations.
And yeah, And one of my daughters called me and she said, "Hey, Dad, you're 10 years old now." You
That's
know, and I
great.
said, "No, I guess you guys are, I'm living in dog years here." So I actually think reminding ourselves that it is a continually new world that we're looking at. I mean,
Mhm.
we have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. So we better darn well be paying attention in the roles that we're in right now. And that's the experience that keeps getting repeated for me. It's like the surprises, and I absolutely continue to look to young people or young thinking people because they see problems that we don't. And I think that's, as I said earlier, I think creating the problem statement can be as important as is more important in a way than pursuing the solution.
Yeah. So Armando, thank you so much. We've come to our end of our time together. I really, really appreciate you being with us today, sharing yourself, sharing your story, sharing California State Park story. Thank you so much for being with us.
Absolute pleasure, and thanks to every one of you for the work you do. Really, it's impossible without all of us, right?
That's great.
Thanks.
Yeah.